In the
The
middle
data
of the
confirms our
boardroom at Reed
projections.
Global,
Your
the
projections? How
powerful
original.
young
This isn't a
CEO,
joke.
Stella
Of
Reed,
course not,
looked
just
at the man
amusing.
in the worn jacket standing near the window and said, in front of dozens of executives, that he was not valuable here.
The
The
East
room
Wing
broke into
design is
quiet
critical.
laughter
Yes, it
as Lucas
aligns with the
Brooks rose
specs.
slowly
What about
from
the
his
timeline?
chair.
We can
He did
adjust.
not argue.
This
He did
is
not
shocking.
raise his voice.
The projections are off
He
by
did not
40%.
explain who he was
How did we
or
miss
why
this?
he had come.
Let's review
Before
the
he
revenue
walked out
forecast.
through the
It
glass
shows a
doors,
15%
he set a
increase.
thin
What about
folder
technical
down on the
risks?
long
Let's mitigate
table
those.
without a
Let's
single
address
word
the
of
market
protest.
challenges.
I
15
agree.
minutes
The
later,
data is concerning.
the
We should
entire
reallocate
executive team
resources.
sat
Good, let's
frozen in
plan.
silence because the man they had just humiliated and dismissed turned out to be the very architect who had quietly built the foundation that turned Reed Global into a billion-dollar empire. Word of what had happened that morning would not stay contained within the boardroom for long, and by the time the sun set over the financial district, the story had already begun its slow journey through every floor of the building, whispered between desks, retold in elevators, sharpened a little more with every new telling. But to understand how a single sentence could unravel so much, it helps to first understand the two worlds that collided in that room, one built entirely on quiet substance, and the other built entirely on visible power. Reed Global occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, a corporation so vast that its name alone could move markets before lunch. Inside its walls, a person's worth was measured the moment they stepped through the revolving doors, weighed instantly against the cut of their suit, the badge on their briefcase, the car that waited for them at the curb. Employees learned early that respect was not earned through patience or quiet competence, but claimed through appearance, through confidence, through the unmistakable signals of money and rank. It was a culture built on speed and spectacle, where hesitation looked like weakness and humility looked like failure. And everyone inside understood the unspoken rule before anyone ever said it aloud. At the center of that world stood Stella Reed, 38 years old, sharp-minded, decisive, and untouchable in the way only the very successful can be. She had inherited nothing but a name and had built everything else herself, clawing her way to the top of an industry that rarely forgave mistakes and never forgot weakness. She believed, with the certainty of someone who had tested the theory 1,000 times, that respect was never given freely, that it had to be demonstrated through position, through results, through the visible proof of power. To Stella, a person's presence in a room was itself a kind of resume, and she had learned to read a stranger's value in the 3 seconds it took them to cross her doorway. It was into this world that Lucas Brooks arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 42 years old, driving a car that had seen better winters, wearing a jacket that had clearly outlived several fashion seasons, and a watch that told time but told nothing else. He carried a single brown leather case, with no logo stitched into its surface, no assistant trailing behind him, no driver waiting outside, nothing that announced his arrival, the way arrivals were supposed to be announced at Reed Global. He simply walked through the lobby doors like a man who had somewhere ordinary to be, unremarkable in every way that the building had trained its people to notice. Lucas had learned, long before that Tuesday morning, that the way a building greeted a visitor said almost everything about the values hidden inside it. Reed Global's lobby was a monument to that principle. Its floors polished to a mirror shine. Its walls lined with framed magazine covers celebrating quarterly earnings and industry awards. Its every surface designed to remind visitors, from the very first step, exactly whose kingdom they were entering. He had walked into dozens of buildings like it over the years, and he no longer expected warmth from any of them. What he expected, and what he received, was the quiet, practiced skepticism of people trained to sort visitors into categories before they had spoken a single word. The receptionist looked up at him with the practiced skepticism of someone who had turned away 100 delivery men mistaking the tower for a warehouse. And when Lucas said he had a meeting concerning the Horizon project, she paused, studied her screen, and asked him to confirm the address twice. A pair of junior managers crossed the lobby mid-conversation, glancing at him for half a second before returning to their phones, one of them muttering under his breath that another vendor must have wandered in looking for the wrong floor. Lucas said nothing to correct the assumption. He only smiled, the kind of small, patient smile of a man who had been underestimated so many times that it no longer stung. And he waited until someone finally agreed to walk him upstairs, into the very heart of the crisis that had been quietly tearing the company apart for weeks. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor, where the air itself seemed heavier, thick with the particular tension of a company running out of answers. Inside the glass-walled conference room, a dozen senior executives sat hunched over laptops and printed reports, their voices overlapping in frustration as they argued over numbers that refused to improve no matter how many times they were recalculated. The Horizon Project, once heralded as the company's next great leap forward, had collapsed into a financial sinkhole, swallowing hundreds of millions of dollars, with no clear path back to solid ground. Every proposed fix had failed. Every consultant hired to save it had left more confused than when they arrived. And the entire floor carried the exhausted, brittle energy of people who suspected they were about to lose everything they had spent years building. Lucas was led quietly to a seat near the back of the room, and he sat down without a word, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes moving slowly across the charts projected on the far wall. He did not interrupt the arguments swirling around him. He did not offer an opinion no one had asked for. He simply watched, absorbing the shape of the crisis, the way a physician studies a patient, before ever reaching for an instrument, and his stillness in a room full of raised voices made him, in a strange way, the most noticeable person there. One of the directors finally turned toward him, irritated by the presence of an unfamiliar face, and demanded to know who exactly he was and what business he had sitting among them. Lucas answered simply that he had come because of the project, offering nothing further, no title, no company name, no explanation that might have satisfied the growing suspicion in the room. The vagueness of his answer did little to ease the tension, and a few executives exchanged uneasy glances, the kind reserved for outsiders who had wandered somewhere they clearly did not belong. It was at that exact moment that the doors opened again, and Stella Reed walked in, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted the way a forest goes quiet before a storm. Conversations dropped to whispers. Papers were straightened, without needing to be. Every eye in the room turned toward her, out of habit, out of respect, out of the particular fear that came from disappointing her. Stella's gaze swept across the table with practiced efficiency, cataloging faces she recognized and pausing, inevitably, on the one she did not. She asked who the man near the back was, her tone flat and businesslike. The question of someone accustomed to instant and complete answers. A junior director stumbled over a response, suggesting perhaps he was an outside guest, perhaps someone's contact, perhaps a mistake in the scheduling system, and the uncertainty in his voice only sharpened the annoyance already gathering behind Stella's eyes. She did not like unexplained things in her building, and she liked them even less in a meeting that was already hemorrhaging money and patience in equal measure. She turned her full attention to Lucas and asked him directly what position he held within the company, and he answered simply that he held no position at all. She asked which firm had sent him, and he told her that he worked independently, without the backing of any organization she would recognize by name. Her questions grew shorter and colder with each answer. The way a lawyer tightens a line of questioning once they sense a witness has nothing solid to stand on, and when she finally asked whether he had even been formally invited to attend, Lucas reached into his jacket and produced a folded letter, offering it to her without protest or urgency. Stella glanced at the paper for barely a second, her eyes skimming rather than reading, and set it back down on the table as though it carried no more weight than a note left by a stranger. She had already made her decision about him, the way she made most decisions, quickly and without much room for revision, and the paper in front of her did nothing to change the shape of that judgment. She concluded, in front of every executive at the table, that he simply did not belong in that room, that whatever letter he carried was insufficient proof of anything that mattered to her. And the finality in her voice left no space for further discussion. Lucas remained perfectly calm through all of it, his posture unchanged, his expression untouched by the dismissal unfolding in front of a dozen witnesses. He did not raise his voice or ask her to reconsider, did not reach for his phone to prove a point, did not offer the kind of desperate explanation that might have salvaged the moment for a lesser man. And then, In front of the entire room, Stella delivered the line that would echo through the company for weeks to come, telling him plainly, and without hesitation, that he was not valuable here. That his presence added nothing to a conversation this important. That he should have known better than to assume otherwise. The silence that followed lasted only a second before it cracked into scattered laughter. The nervous kind that spreads through a room when people are relieved the humiliation is happening to someone else. A few executives smirked and returned to their laptops as though the matter were already settled. A few others lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the cruelty of the moment but unwilling to say so out loud. And none of them noticed that Lucas had not flinched, had not reddened, had not shown even the smallest flicker of the shame the room expected to see on his face. He did not defend himself. He did not list credentials or mention names that might have changed the temperature of the room in an instant. He simply rose from his chair, gathered his single leather case, and prepared to leave the way he had entered, quietly and without ceremony. Before he reached the door, he paused just long enough to place 3 items on the table. A slim folder of documents, a small unmarked drive, and a single handwritten note folded once down the middle. He said only that they might need it later, his voice carrying no bitterness, no warning, nothing that suggested he expected anyone to take the offering seriously. Then he turned and walked out of the glass doors, down the long hallway, past the receptionist who barely looked up this time, and out into the ordinary noise of the street below, leaving behind a room full of people who had already begun to forget he had ever been there at all. The meeting resumed almost immediately, the way meetings do when there is more money at stake than patience, and for a long while no one so much as glanced at the folder left behind on the table. It sat there through another 20 minutes of arguing, ignored the way most warnings are ignored right up until they matter, until one of the senior directors, a man named Walter Higgins, who had grown tired of listening to the same failed proposals cycle back around, reached over out of boredom and opened it simply to have something new to look at. He expected marketing filler or a stray sales pitch, the kind of unsolicited nonsense that occasionally found its way into important rooms, and he began flipping through the pages with the distracted half-attention of a man killing time. Within a few pages, that distraction disappeared entirely. What Walter found inside was not a sales pitch or a vague proposal, but a detailed and precise breakdown of the market conditions strangling the Horizon project, paired with financial modeling, so specific it seemed to have been built directly from the company's own internal numbers. There were competitive forecasts mapped months into the future, projections that lined up with unsettling accuracy against threats the company had only just begun to notice, and a section outlining an approach to artificial intelligence integration that solved, almost elegantly, the exact bottleneck that had stalled the project for the better part of a year. Walter read in silence, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to disbelief. And when he finally looked up, his hands were not entirely steady. He announced to the room that someone needed to see this immediately. And one by one the other executives leaned in, passing pages between them with a kind of reverent urgency that had been entirely absent from the meeting until that moment. The data inside referenced systems and figures that were never shared outside the company, numbers that existed only in internal reports few people in that very room had clearance to view. It became clear, page by page, that whoever had written this had not guessed at Reed Global's problems from the outside looking in, but had understood the company from somewhere deep inside its architecture, the way a person understands a house they built with their own hands. Stella, who had remained standing near the head of the table through all of this, finally stepped closer and asked to see the pages for herself. Her earlier certainty had begun to waver, replaced by a tightening unease she did not yet have words for, and she read in silence as the room around her grew quieter with every passing minute. Someone reached for the small drive that had been left beside the folder and connected it to a laptop, and as the files loaded onto the main screen, the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting to see what else the man they had just dismissed had left behind for them. The files on the drive were older, formatted in a style the company had long since abandoned, the kind of raw architectural documents that belonged to the earliest days of any organization still finding its shape. There were original blueprints for systems the company still relied on every single day, foundational designs for the data platforms that quietly ran beneath every department in the building, strategic models that had clearly been drafted years before Reed Global had ever become the name it was now. Buried in the metadata of the earliest files was a single author credit, unchanged across dozens of documents spanning what appeared to be more than a decade, and the name attached to every one of them was Lucas Brooks. A stunned silence spread across the executive table as people scrolled back through file after file, each one stamped with the same quiet signature. Someone whispered that this could not be a coincidence, that the sheer volume and precision of the work pointed to someone who had not merely consulted for the company once, but had shaped its very bones from the inside. Stella stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at a name she had heard for the very first time only an hour earlier, the same name attached to a man she had just told, in front of everyone she worked with, that he was not valuable. It was an older executive named Richard Calloway, one of the last remaining members of the company's founding era, who finally broke the stunned silence with a slow, disbelieving recognition. He said the name aloud again, testing it against a memory that had clearly been buried for a long time. And then he told the room he remembered it, that he had heard it once, many years earlier, back when Reed Global was little more than an ambitious idea crowded into 3 rented offices. There had been, he said, a strategist behind the earliest version of the company, a mind so precise and so quietly brilliant that the founders had built their entire structural foundation around his recommendations, yet almost no one outside the inner circle had ever known his face. Richard explained that the man had never appeared at press events, never accepted a public title, never allowed his name to circulate the way most architects of success eagerly allowed theirs to spread. He had turned down significant equity when it was offered, had declined every opportunity to attach his identity to the company's rising fortunes, and had simply vanished from the picture entirely once the systems he built were strong enough to stand on their own. For years afterward, people inside the company spoke of him only in fragments, a rumor passed down through departing employees, a name occasionally mentioned in old meeting notes that no one had bothered to explain. As Richard spoke, several younger executives had already begun searching for anything they could find on the name. Scrolling through old internal archives, cross-referencing project histories that had long since been filed away and forgotten. Each search returned more of the same unsettling pattern, project after project, tracing back to contributions from a man who had apparently shaped some of the company's most critical early decisions, and then simply disappeared from its records. The deeper they searched, the more the shock in the room curdled into something closer to disbelief, because the picture forming in front of them did not resemble a vendor or a wandering stranger at all. It resembled a founder who had chosen, deliberately and for reasons no one yet understood, to remain invisible. The room, which only an hour earlier had been consumed entirely by the collapsing numbers of the Horizon project, now found itself gripped by something even more urgent, a growing understanding that the answers they desperately needed might have already walked out the door. 15 years earlier, before Reed Global carried the weight and reputation it carried now, Lucas Brooks had been the quiet, strategic mind working behind its earliest and most fragile years. He had built the governance systems that later generations of executives assumed had simply always existed, designed the original data infrastructure long before anyone used the word infrastructure so casually, and shaped the growth models that eventually became the company's entire operating philosophy. In those early years, the company had operated out of 3 cramped rented offices above a printing shop, its founders young and hungry, and constantly on the verge of running out of money before the next contract came through. Lucas had been the quiet presence in the back corner of those offices, arriving before anyone else and leaving after the lights had already been switched off, filling notebook after notebook with the frameworks that would eventually decide how the company hired, how it grew, how it treated the people who worked inside it. He rarely spoke in meetings unless directly asked a question, and even then his answers tended to be short, precise, and almost always correct in ways that unsettled people who had spent years building confidence out of louder methods. He had done all of this without ever stepping into the spotlight, preferring to work from the margins of the organization rather than its center, content to see his ideas take root without needing his name attached to their success. Once the company had stabilized, Once its foundations no longer required his daily attention, Lucas made a decision that few in his position would have understood at the time. He chose to leave, and his reasons had nothing to do with money, since he had already turned down more of it than most people ever earned in a lifetime, and nothing to do with conflict, since no disagreement or falling out had pushed him toward the door. He left simply because he wanted an ordinary life, one without the constant demands of recognition, without the weight of a title that would follow him into every room for the rest of his career. He turned down dozens of offers in the years that followed, invitations to conferences, requests to consult, opportunities to reclaim the kind of prominence most people spent their entire lives chasing, and he turned every single one of them away without much explanation. For more than a decade, no one at Reed Global knew where he had gone or what he was doing, and the company had simply continued forward, building on top of a foundation whose original architect had quietly stepped out of the frame entirely. Stella stood very still at the head of the table as this history unfolded around her, piece by piece, each new detail landing with the weight of something she could not yet fully process. The man she had dismissed with a single cold sentence in front of her entire executive team was not a stranger who had wandered into the wrong meeting. He was, by every account now surfacing in front of her, something closer to a legend within the very company she had spent years believing she understood completely. And the realization settled over her with a heaviness that had nothing to do with numbers or strategy at all. The crisis surrounding the Horizon project had not eased in the slightest during this discovery, and if anything, the pressure surrounding it had only intensified with each passing day. Word had reached the executive floor that a rival company was preparing to launch a competing product months ahead of schedule, a development that threatened to undercut everything Reed Global had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to build. Shareholders had grown restless, their patience thinning with every earnings call that failed to deliver the reassurance they were looking for. And the pressure trickling down from the board had begun to feel less like guidance and more like an ultimatum. It became increasingly clear, as the executive team pored over what remained of Lucas's documents, that he was the only person who fully understood how the deeper architecture of the company actually functioned. His notes referenced systems layered so far beneath the surface that even senior engineers struggled to locate their origins, connections between departments that no current employee had ever been trained to see. Attempts to reach him directly went nowhere at first, message after message returning no response. And when someone finally managed to get him on the phone, his answer was brief and unmistakably final. He told them simply that he had already given them the solution, that everything necessary had been left behind in the folder and the drive on that conference table, and that his part in this particular chapter of the company's story had already concluded. The problem, painfully obvious to everyone listening, was that none of them possessed the depth of understanding required to properly execute what he had outlined, no matter how many times they reread his notes or ran his models through their own systems. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Stella felt something close to failure settle over her, and it had nothing to do with strategy or execution at all. It was not the collapsing numbers of the Horizon project that kept her awake that night, though those numbers were bad enough on their own to justify sleeplessness. It was the quiet, uncomfortable understanding that she had looked directly at the answer to her company's most urgent crisis and dismissed it in less than a minute, judging a man's worth by the fabric of his jacket rather than the depth of his mind. She had built her entire career on the belief that she could read value instantly, that a glance was enough to separate the important from the irrelevant, and that belief had just failed her in front of everyone she worked with. The following morning, Stella made a decision that surprised everyone who worked closely with her, choosing to leave without her usual driver, without the assistant who normally arranged her schedule down to the minute, without any of the practiced armor she typically carried into difficult situations. She got behind the wheel of her own car for the first time in longer than she could remember, and drove across the city alone, guided only by an old address one of the senior executives had managed to track down through records nobody had touched in years. The building she eventually found bore no resemblance to the glass tower she worked in every day. A modest storefront office, tucked between a bakery and a shuttered bookstore, with no sign announcing what happened inside its walls. She pushed open the door, and found Lucas exactly as she might have imagined him if she had allowed herself to imagine him at all, seated near a window with a cup of coffee cooling beside him and a paperback book open in his hands. He looked up at her without surprise, as though some part of him had expected this visit long before she ever decided to make it, and he set the book down slowly, giving her his full and unhurried attention. Stella stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, the words she had rehearsed on the drive over suddenly feeling insufficient for the size of what she needed to say, and when she finally spoke, the apology came out simpler and more honest than anything she had planned. She told him she was sorry, plainly, and without the polish she usually brought into difficult conversations, and she admitted that she had judged him the moment he walked into that room, without ever considering that her judgment might be wrong. Lucas listened without interrupting, his expression calm and unreadable in the way it had been the entire time she had known him, and when she finished, he did not offer forgiveness right away or absolve her of the discomfort she was clearly sitting with. Instead, he asked her a single question, quiet and direct, wondering aloud whether she would have offered him a seat that day if he had walked in wearing a suit worth $5,000 instead of the jacket he had actually chosen to wear. Stella opened her mouth to answer and found, for perhaps the first time in her professional life, that she had no response ready. The honest answer sat uncomfortably close to the surface, and she understood, even without saying it aloud, that the question was not really about clothing or appearances at all. It was about everything she had built her career on, every quick judgment she had trusted without question, every assumption she had made about who deserved a seat at her table and who did not, and none of those answers felt as solid to her now as they had only a day earlier. Lucas gestured toward the empty chair across from him, and Stella sat down, grateful for the small mercy of not having to stand through whatever conversation came next. He told her, without bitterness or lecture in his voice, that he had met a great many people over the years since he had left the company behind, people from every level of industry and influence imaginable. Almost all of them, he said, had looked at him the same way she had looked at him that day, scanning the surface for signals of importance, cataloging his car and his clothing, and his manner of speech before ever bothering to ask a single question about what he actually knew or understood. He described, without any trace of self-pity, the years he had spent working quietly on projects that never carried his name, watching younger executives take credit for frameworks he had built years before they ever set foot in the industry, and he told her that none of it had ever bothered him the way she might expect. What bothered him instead, he explained, was watching talented people get dismissed in rooms exactly like the one she ran, overlooked, simply because they had not yet learned to perform confidence the way the industry demanded, their ideas discarded before anyone had taken the time to actually understand them. He had seen brilliant engineers pushed out of meetings because they stumbled over their words. He had seen quiet analysts denied promotions because they lacked the polish that came so easily to people who had grown up with money and connections already paving their way forward. Very few of those people, he continued, had ever thought to look past the surface toward the things that actually mattered. The depth of someone's knowledge, the quality of their character, the real and lasting contributions they had made to the world around them. Whether or not anyone had ever noticed those contributions at the time they were made. He explained that recognition was a strange and fickle thing, quick to gather around whatever glittered the brightest in any given room, while genuine respect took considerably longer to earn and required the kind of patient attention most people simply weren't willing to give. Reputation, he said, was what caused people to notice someone walking into a room. Character was what determined whether that same person deserved to be trusted once the room had gone quiet again. Stella sat with those words for a long moment, turning them over the way she might have examined a difficult contract clause, searching for the flaw in the logic, and finding none. She realized, sitting in that small, unmarked office, that the culture she had spent years building at Reed Global had been shaped entirely around the very instincts Lucas was gently describing, a culture that rewarded appearance over substance, confidence over competence, the loud and visible over the quiet and essential. She had built an entire corporate philosophy around exactly the kind of judgment that had just cost her company its most valuable resource for over a decade. And the weight of that realization did not lift easily. In the weeks that followed, Word of what had happened in that conference room spread quietly through the upper levels of Reed Global, carried less through official announcement, and more through the kind of hushed conversation that moves fastest through companies under pressure. The executive team, humbled by the sheer scale of what they had nearly discarded, began to examine their own assumptions with a discomfort few of them had expected to feel. Meetings that once prioritized polish and presentation started making quiet room for the voices that had always been present but rarely heard. Junior analysts who understood systems better than their titles suggested, engineers who had been overlooked for promotion despite work that spoke for itself far louder than any interview ever could. She began, in those quiet weeks, to notice things about her own company that she had somehow never noticed before. Small habits woven so deeply into daily operations that they had become invisible to her. She noticed how quickly a candidate's resume was set aside if it lacked a familiar university name printed at the top. She noticed how junior employees hesitated before speaking in meetings where senior leadership was present, as though their ideas required special permission before they were allowed to exist out loud. She noticed, most uncomfortably of all, how closely her own instincts mirrored the very judgment that had cost her company its most valuable asset for over a decade, and she began to wonder how many other Lucas Brookses had walked through her doors over the years, unnoticed, unheard, and eventually gone for good. Stella returned to that small office more than once in the weeks that followed, each visit a little less formal than the last, each conversation chipping away a little more at the certainty she had once carried so effortlessly. She eventually asked Lucas directly whether he would consider returning to help the company navigate its way through the crisis, still threatening to unravel everything it had built. Lucas did not answer immediately, taking his time the way he seemed to take his time with everything. And when he finally agreed, it came with conditions that surprised her, far more than his answer itself. He told her plainly that he had no interest in a title, no interest in equity, no interest in the kind of corner office that came stitched with importance and expectation in equal measure. What he wanted instead was something far less conventional and, in its own way, far more difficult to build. He wanted the opportunity to design a new approach to how the company brought people in and recognized their value once they arrived. A system built around what people actually understood and contributed, rather than the surface impressions they happened to make in their first 30 seconds through the door. Stella agreed without hesitation, and over the following months, the shift inside Reed Global moved slower than anyone expected, but steadier than anyone had dared to hope. Interviews changed shape, placing far greater weight on demonstrated understanding than on polish or pedigree. Meetings began making space for voices that had previously gone unheard, simply because they belonged to people without impressive titles attached to their names, and slowly, department by department, the culture that had once rewarded appearance above all else began making room for something closer to substance. Lucas approached the work the same way he approached everything else, without urgency, without the need to prove anything to anyone in the room. He spent his first weeks back simply listening, sitting in on meetings the way he had sat in on that very first one, watching more than speaking, letting the engineers and analysts explain their understanding of the systems before he offered a single correction. When he did speak, his explanations were patient and thorough, breaking down complicated architecture into pieces that even the newest hires could follow. And slowly, the fear that had once surrounded difficult questions began to soften into curiosity instead. People who had once been afraid to admit they did not understand something found themselves asking questions freely in meetings where Lucas was present, because he never once made anyone feel small for not already knowing the answer. The Horizon project, once teetering on the edge of complete collapse, began to stabilize under the quiet guidance of the very architecture Lucas had built years earlier and refined once again during those difficult months. Systems that had confused engineers for weeks suddenly made sense once viewed through the lens Lucas provided. Patient and methodical. Teaching, rather than simply fixing, ensuring that the people around him understood not just what to do, but why it worked the way it did. Within a matter of months, the numbers that had once dominated every anxious meeting began trending in a direction the company had almost given up, hoping to see again, and the sense of dread that had settled over the executive floor slowly began to lift. On the day the company finally held its first company-wide gathering since the crisis had begun, Stella stood before thousands of employees gathered across the auditorium and the screens broadcasting into offices around the world. She spoke honestly about the mistake she had made in that conference room months earlier, describing without excuse or softening the moment she had looked at a man's jacket instead of his mind and decided, in an instant, that he had nothing to offer her company. She told the story plainly, without asking for sympathy, because she understood by then that the lesson mattered far more than her own comfort in retelling it. Lucas stood quietly near the side of the stage as she spoke, his expression unreadable in the same calm way it had been from the very first day anyone in that building had noticed him. When Stella finished, and the room rose into applause, he offered only a small, unbothered smile. The kind of smile that suggested the recognition itself meant very little to him personally. What mattered to him, far more than any ovation, was watching an entire organization begin, slowly and imperfectly, to measure people by what they actually built, rather than by what they happened to be wearing when they walked through the door. Richard Calloway, watching from near the back of the auditorium, found himself thinking back to those early years above the printing shop, remembering a quiet man in the corner who never once asked for recognition, even as everyone around him climbed toward it. He thought about how easily history erased the people who worked without needing applause, and how rare it was to see a company circle back and correct that erasure, while the person who deserved it was still alive to witness it. He mentioned this to a colleague beside him, and the two of them agreed, quietly, that whatever else came of the Horizon crisis, the company had gained something that no earnings report would ever fully capture. On his way out of the building that evening, Lucas wore the same simple clothing he had worn on the very first day he arrived, unchanged by everything that had unfolded in the months between. This time, however, employees rose from their desks as he passed through the hallways, not out of obligation or fear, but out of something closer to genuine respect earned through understanding rather than assumption. They did not stand because they finally knew he had once built the foundation their entire company still stood on. They stood because they had learned, through his quiet example and Stella's public humility, a lesson that would stay with them long after the details of the Horizon crisis had faded into ordinary company history. The true measure of a person, they had come to understand, was never found in the suit they wore, the car they drove, or the title printed beneath their name on a business card. It lived instead in the things they quietly built when no one was watching, in the patience they showed toward people who had nothing obvious to offer in return, and in the way they chose to treat others once the room had gone silent and the applause had finally faded away.